1958 represented the waning years of Harley Earl's influence over design at General Motors, and the 1958 Oldsmobile and Buick perhaps best exemplify why Earl was about ready for retirement. The style of these vehicles was admittedly quite dated looking compared to vehicles like the 1957 Chryslers that had come out the year before, and the designers over at General Motors recognized that they had to go in a new direction for the 1959 model year after these vehicles came out. However, when looking at the 1958 Oldsmobile as a specific piece of art related to the time, I have to say it's a pretty fascinating overall car. Let's take a look at this beautiful 1958 Super 88 convertible finished in a color that I believe is called heather. And again, this was before the longer, lower, wider type of philosophy would take over at General Motors. It was already starting to take over at other automakers, but this car is just awesome. I believe it's also owned by a former GM chief engineer. So we'll walk around it, talk a little bit about the 1958 Oldsmobile's history as well. Now, for 1958, Oldsmobile's lineup got a few changes, and some were quite notable. The first was that the overall model lineup changed. There was no more the Golden Rocket 88, the Super 88, and the Starfire 98, which were the vehicles for 1957. But because of that 1957 model year's really lukewarm reception, Oldsmobile in total sold 384,000 vehicles in 1957. Designers redid, as was the typical trend for the time, the entire model lineup the next year with a new look. And they also went about changing the names of the models. There was at the low end the Dynamic 88. Then one up from that was the Super 88, which this is one of 3,799 convertibles that were made in 1958 that were Super 88s. And then there was the 98. Unfortunately, changing the name of the models really didn't help when it came to sales. And for 1958, Oldsmobile only sold 296,000 units, so almost a 100,000 unit decrease year over year. Now, of course, the U.S. was starting to go into the late 1950s recession, but the fact of the matter is that Oldsmobile was not gaining market share during this time frame. And perhaps one of the reasons for that was the styling of this 58 Oldsmobile. Now, the 57 and 58 share quite a few components, but the front end was a completely new look with quad headlamps as opposed to the dual units that were on the 1957. By this point in 1958, all 50 U.S. states had allowed quad headlamps. That was something that was not true for the 1957 model year, and that's why you don't see a lot of 1957 model year cars with quad headlamps. But for 1958, that was true, and it was available to be sold across the entire United States. I guess I shouldn't say all 50 states either, because Alaska and Hawaii were not part of the United States in 1958. That would come about in 1959. And I have to say the front end of the car has kind of this menacing look. You have this very wide, thin-barred grille, but an extremely heavy-looking bumper. I don't think that it gets more heavy-looking than what you see there. And that bumper must weigh hundreds of pounds. It's just pure chrome. And you got some interesting sculpture here, let's say, on the hood. You have this concave surface with the Oldsmobile block lettering that's very distinctive with a distinct crease at the front end of the hood there. You have the crease that runs up along the hood until the hood ornament. And then that crease really divides in two, and you have a nice little, let's call it a divot, that runs all the way back to the cowl. But the amazingly garish and kitschy section of this car is really the body side and the rear. Look at how many chrome details there are on the side of this vehicle. There's that spear that starts all the way at the front of the vehicle and continues through the door. There's a spear within a spear, in fact, up there. And then you have these strakes that run along the quarter panel, as well as a molding that sits atop the quarter panel. And of course, out back, you have the tail lamps that are flanked in chrome, and interestingly, again, heavy style rear bumper with that Oldsmobile block lettering on the trunk, and even little details, chrome details above the Oldsmobile block lettering on the trunk. It's just an amazingly busy rear three-quarter view for this car, and it was not what the designers intended, Aside from Mr. Earl himself, who specifically commanded designers to put all of these chromes and baubles and bolt-ons and bedizen the body side, how's that for alliteration, of this 1958 Oldsmobile. And how do I know that? Well, let's take a look at the sketch that really precipitated the look of this vehicle. This sketch was done by Bernie Smith, who was part of Art Ross's studio. Art Ross was Oldsmobile's chief designer, I believe, since 1946, and he retired from General Motors in 1959, perhaps unceremoniously because he helped lead the design of this 1958 Oldsmobile. Now, you'll notice that the sketch is much more dynamic and exciting, at least to my eye, than the production 1958 Oldsmobile, but it has lots of the elements. Notice the quad headlamps up front that we were talking about before, the very wide bumper that admittedly, even in the sketch, looks pretty heavy, but not quite as heavy as the final version. Of course, you can also see the spear that runs along the body side all the way through the door that also encompasses the headlamps. Here it's accentuated in two tones, a different color from the body. And you have a similar look out back with the tail lamps, although the tail lamps here are much smaller than what is on the overall vehicle that made it through to production. But the main difference that you'll see is that the sketch doesn't have anything in terms of those strakes on the side or the very heavy chrome on the spear. It's just accentuated tastefully with a light accent of chrome. There's not the chrome within the chrome spear. There's not the chrome atop the quarter panel. So the sketch is interestingly far more toned down than the production model, which is an extremely rare thing to say. Let me also just point out that I believe the sketch is done on Canson paper, which is pretty period correct. A lot of designers used to sketch with this, and it really made the cars kind of pop. But Bernie Smith must have been a master of the Canson paper because the car pops. And the amazing thing is, look at the background in terms of the color on this particular sketch. That's the color of the Canson paper. And then when you look at that background and you look at the car itself, you notice that he's really just put a lot of highlights in many places and let the background bleed through. Take a look at the roof, for example. He's really not added all that much aside from that highlight up front near the leading edge of the windshield, the A-pillars, of course, and then the roof molding. But aside from that, it's really just the paper coming through. That's not pencil or pastel or anything on the Canson paper. It's just the paper. And then he's added those highlights. What an awesome thing. And you can notice if you look at this sketch more and more how much of just the paper coming through he used as an artist as opposed to using some form of media to put over top of the Canson paper. Now, returning to a photo of the actual vehicle itself, this is a 1958 Oldsmobile Fiesta wagon. And I wanted to show this, by the way, this is photographed by the St. Louis Car Museum. They have a lot of cars that are for sale and some great pictures. Highly recommend you check out their website or visit. But notice those strakes on the side, the spear within a spear. That was not part of Bernie's original sketch to have kind of a spear within a spear up front. And the Fiesta wagon I had to show because look at, there's the strakes on the roof panel even. It just does not get more complicated from a design standpoint than what you see here. And again, this is clearly more complicated than what was envisioned for the original design. Interestingly, Bernie recounted the story of that sketch that he did to a website called Dean's Garage. And Dean's Garage, by the way, is a great website, deansgarage.com. Lots of stories about design and highly recommend checking it out. But Bernie recounted the story of that sketch to Dean's Garage, and he noted that Art Ross, who was the studio head of Oldsmobile, was very upset because apparently Bernie had put that sketch up on a board and Harley Earl walked in and exclaimed that that was the design for the 1958 Oldsmobile even before studio chief Art Ross had a chance to look at the sketch. And Art Ross was apparently just extremely peeved that he now had to execute a design that he didn't even know existed. He hadn't seen it on the board yet. In any case, let's return to this 1958 Oldsmobile and the rear of the car. Look at those tail lamps. You have the pod lamp rocket-style tail lamp up front, and then the tail lamp continues down to the bumper. And, of course, those little details that I mentioned, the crosses with the Oldsmobile logo in the middle. And one of the things that you can see here is that on the driver's side, the tail lamp is rotated. The top portion is rotated here clockwise. And why is that? What is lurking beneath that portion of the car? Well, it's the fuel cap, of course. What an innovative way to disguise the fuel filler by putting it underneath that piece of trim so that you can't see it normally. GM had some clever elements like this. Other cars, like the 1948 Cadillac, would have the fuel cap under the tail lamp. They did it on a few cars, and I think it was a kind of cool and tasteful touch. I wish they would do something like that today, as opposed to every car's got kind of the standard fuel filler door. Oh well. And here we have one last look at this crazy body side with that tail lamp. Again, the top portion rotated open so you can see the fuel filler door. But just an amazing amount of chrome. I don't even know how you could measure it. Bill Mitchell used to say that designers were putting chrome on with trowels at this point under Harley Earl, and that's absolutely true. Again, you can tell that this was really on its way out, and Mr. Earl, as he was known, was, I guess his sense of style was, let's just say, becoming a bit less novel than his sense of style was in earlier years. Now, as we turn to the inside of this vehicle, you'll notice that this is really the age of safety, where safety was starting to come about in car design, and that is featured here in a number of elements. One is, take a look at that dash padding that spans the entire dash. That's safety padding there as opposed to it just being metal. That was something that, again, designers were starting to concentrate on, is having these crash pads on instrument panels. Sometimes they were optional in vehicles, but nonetheless, that was something that was coming into vogue. The steering wheel as well on the 58 Oldsmobile is a so-called safety steering wheel. It doesn't have a collapsible steering column, but it doesn't have a protruding center hub. That's why that hub is recessed, such that it doesn't impale you if your body kind of crashes into it. And then the door panels even have some distinct padding to them that makes them look good and richly detailed, as well as adds an element of safety. And of course, part of safety is also being able to see out of the vehicle, hence that rear kind of canted A-pillar so that you have better visibility up front. So while they're certainly not nearly as safe in any stretch of the imagination as a modern car, no airbags here, no real crumple zones or anything like that. Those toothpick A-pillars are not going to be helpful in a rollover crash either. The roof is going to cave in. But designers and engineers really were starting to think about safety at this point in time, in part because the vehicles were traveling much faster than they ever had. If you went, let's say 20 years in arrears, cars weren't generally topping, let's say 100 miles an hour, and cruising speeds were really about 40 or 50 miles per hour. There weren't expressways and freeways at that point in time, but now you're getting into the age of the Eisenhower interstate system, not too far away from this 1958 model year, and safety became increasingly important. One other thing I want to point out is an innovative feature that this 58 Oldsmobile has, and that is the pop-out radio. It's actually a removable radio that you could take out and listen to on its own. So the owner of this car has kind of retracted it halfway out of the dash so you can see that it is removable. Many people don't know, though, that the 58 Oldsmobile has that feature, and I think it's the first car with that removable radio, something that become very popular in the 80s, but here Oldsmobile had it in 1958. And here's another view of the interior from the driver's side of the cockpit. That steering wheel just has some beautiful details, including the hub. And if you notice closely, take a look at the shift indicator. It's on the dash. You'll see it says PNDSLR. What's going on with that? Well, this is before the shift quadrant was standardized to the typical Perndl or Pernsel indicator, and reverse was after park. On these, the reverse is all the way at the end. And that was typical of the GM Hydromatic transmission, the original Hydromatic, which is what this car has. This is not a turbo Hydromatic. This is still the original Hydromatic. It's a 4-speed transmission with a fluid coupling, a good bulletproof transmission, but that shift quadrant was used on other General Motors transmissions at the time, including the Roto Hydromatic that came out in the early 1960s. Unfortunately, the Roto Hydromatic didn't have the standard Hydromatic's reputation for reliability. Now, what engine did you get in your Oldsmobile for 1958? Well, it was a 371 cubic inch Oldsmobile V8 with a 10-to-1 compression ratio, and there were three different forms. There was the 2-barrel version, the 4-barrel version, and the super hot J2 2-barrel carbureted version of the Oldsmobile V8 during that particular model year, each of which was just an excellent engine. The top of the line being the J2 that was rated at 312 horsepower and 415 pound-feet of torque. That would really help that 58 Oldsmobile accelerate from 0 to 60 in about 8 seconds or maybe even a little bit under that. Quite impressive. The 4-barrel engine developed 305 horsepower and 410 pound-feet, and the 2-barrel powered Oldsmobile developed 265 horsepower and 390 pound-feet. The 4-barrel was standard in the Super 88 as well as the 98. The 2-barrel version was standard in the Dynamic 88, and the J2 was the optional engine that you could get with those 3 2-barrel carburetors. And here's a picture of an Oldsmobile J2 with the 3 2-barrel carburetors, a super rare option that you often don't see anymore. And these 3 2-barrel carburetor setups will be used on General Motors in many divisions. Well, some other divisions, let's just say. Pontiac would employ it. But after the 1966 model year, General Motors kind of walked away from it because they were a little bit trouble-prone and also more costly. And by that point, General Motors had introduced their bigger Quadrajet 4-barrel carburetor, which was simpler and more reliable. And so they just ended up using that instead. What do you think about the 58 Oldsmobile and its design? Do you like it? Do you not like it? What do you think about this particular one? I think this is an awesome car overall. And while I don't necessarily care for the 58 Oldsmobile's design, this one looks awesome. Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.